I sought solitude in the West Virginia mountains, a quiet escape from my past. But a brutal winter storm brought an unexpected visitor to my door, a German shepherd, barely alive, carrying a secret that would shatter my world and reveal a hidden family legacy. Subscribe to find out what happens next. You know, sometimes the quiet isn't just about the absence of sound. For me, it was a heavy blanket, a medicine I craved after years of battle. This isolated cabin, nestled deep in the West Virginia mountains, was my sanctuary. I'm Alex, a U.S. Park Ranger, though the title still feels a little new after the uniform I used to wear. At 35, my frame is probably leaner than when I was a Marine, but the strength I earned carrying a pack and a burden is still coiled in my muscles. My short dark hair is starting to show a few threads of silver at the temples, a roadmap of the years and the scars you can't see. My face, etched with lines of hardship, still holds a kindness in my eyes, a small mercy I cling to, something even the horrors of war couldn't extinguish. I came here, to my late grandfather David's final sanctuary, to escape the ghosts that followed me from the desert sands. Every gust of wind through the pines sounded like a whisper from a past I couldn't outrun. Every creak of the old logs was a reminder of something broken within me. I dressed against the biting cold in an old, faded ranger shirt, a heavy canvas jacket, worn brown trousers, and sturdy work boots. My movements were quiet, purposeful, a stark contrast to the turmoil that churned within. The cabin was my fortress, a simple structure of dark, weathered logs, a defiant sentinel against the wilderness. I knew nothing of its deeper history, nothing of the memories it held for others. I was unaware that many years ago, this very cabin had served as a beacon of safety in the memory of a German shepherd, a loyal companion who had visited this place with his owner, a dear friend of David's. For me, it was just a place to be alone, a place where the only sounds were the wind in the trees and the crackle of the fire. The winter had been relentless, burying the landscape under a thick shroud of pristine white. Snow clung to the branches of the pines, weighing them down like weary shoulders. Each day was a simple routine: chop wood, check the snares I set for small game, strictly for observation and population control, a ranger's duty, maintain the cabin, and stare into the flames, trying to burn away the images that haunted my sleep. I had come here to forget, to let the silence heal the wounds that no one could see, the invisible ones that festered beneath the surface of my calm exterior. I hadn't expected it to be broken. The profound quiet of the mountains was a physical thing, a heavy blanket that smothered sound and thought alike, and it was the only medicine that had ever truly worked for me. Sometimes, when the silence was too heavy, I'd find myself unconsciously tracing the faint outline of the C7 tattoo on my forearm, a subtle reminder of the unit I'd served with, the men I'd lost. It was a scar, both visible and internal, a constant companion to the wounding I carried. I'd try to push it away, to focus on the tangible, the mundane, the scent of pine and wood smoke was a comfort, grounding me in the present, but the mind has a way of drifting, always returning to the broken pieces. I wanted to believe I was healing, that this solitary existence was enough to mend what was shattered, but deep down, a part of me knew I was simply patching myself up, not truly rebuilding. The storm began in the late afternoon, a whisper that quickly grew into a roar. The sky turned a bruised purple-gray, and the wind howled through the valley like a hungry wolf. Snow began to fall, not in gentle flakes, but in a blinding horizontal torrent that erased the world outside my window. I secured the shutters, added another log to the roaring fire in the stone hearth, and settled into my grandfather's worn armchair, the familiar leather creaking beneath my weight. The cabin groaned under the assault of the blizzard, but it was solid, built by hands that understood the fury of a West Virginia winter. I closed my eyes, letting the storm's chaos drown out the noise in my head, a temporary reprieve from the internal battle. It felt like the outside world was finally mirroring the tempest inside me. If you've ever felt lost, like you're searching for a beacon of hope in the middle of a storm, then you know the feeling of desperately wanting to connect, even when you're pushing the world away. If that resonates, please consider subscribing to the channel. Your support helps us share these stories of resilience and connection. It was hours later, deep in the night, when I first heard it, a faint, desperate scratching at the heavy oak door. At first, I dismissed it as a branch scraping against the wood, a trick of the wind, but the sound came again, weaker this time, followed by a low, mournful whine that was almost lost in the gale. It wasn't the wind, It was the sound of a living creature, a fragile life trying to pierce through the storm's fury. Adrenaline, a familiar and unwelcome companion from my past, surged through me. My hand instinctively went to the heavy iron poker from the fireplace, my movement swift and silent. Who or what could be out there in a storm like this? A lost wolf, perhaps? Or a mountain lion driven by hunger? I moved to the door, listening intently. The scratching had stopped, but I could sense a presence on the other side, a fragile life fading in the cold. Taking a deep breath, I unlatched the heavy bar securing the door and pulled it inward just enough to see. A blast of wind and snow rushed into the warm cabin, stealing my breath. And there, collapsed on my doorstep, was a dog. It was a magnificent German shepherd, its thick coat a beautiful mix of gray and white, now matted with ice and what looked alarmingly like blood. The animal was barely breathing, its body half buried in a fresh drift of snow. Its powerful form was limp, a testament to a battle lost against the elements and something far worse. Without a second thought, my marine training kicked in, pushing aside the fear, replacing it with an urgent primal need to act. I swung the door wide open. The dog lifted its head weakly, its intelligent eyes meeting mine for a brief moment before its strength gave out completely. This was Koda, a creature driven by the faint, lingering memory of a safe haven from his youth, a desperate, instinctual pilgrimage to the one place he knew might hold salvation. He had made it, but just barely. I knelt in the snow, my hands expertly and gently running over the dog's body, checking for the source of the bleeding. I found a deep gash on its flank and several smaller wounds that looked jagged and unnatural. This was no accident. "Easy, boy," I murmured, my voice rough from disuse. "You're safe now." I carefully scooped the large dog into my arms, surprised by its weight, and carried it inside, kicking the door shut against the raging storm. I laid the animal on the thick bearskin rug in front of the fireplace, the warmth of the flames beginning to thaw the ice from its fur. I retrieved my old military first aid kit, its contents familiar and reassuring in my hands. I worked with practiced efficiency, cleaning the wounds, applying antiseptic, and skillfully stitching the worst of the gashes. The dog remained unconscious, its breathing shallow but steady. As I worked, I felt an unfamiliar connection to this brave animal, a shared understanding of survival, of enduring pain in a world that had turned hostile. The silence of the cabin was no longer empty. It was filled with the quiet rhythm of two souls, one saving the other, bound together by the fury of the storm. The world, in that moment, was born again in silence, a fragile hope blossoming in the heart of the blizzard. The blizzard had exhausted its fury during the night, leaving behind a landscape of pristine, sculpted white under a brilliant morning sun. I woke on the armchair, a stiff crick in my neck, the fire in the hearth reduced to a bed of glowing red embers. My first conscious thought was of the dog. I looked toward the bearskin rug and found two intelligent amber eyes watching me. Koda was awake. He had not moved from his spot, but his posture was different. There was an alertness in his gaze, a quiet dignity that defied the suffering he had endured. He was a creature of immense strength, not just of body, but of spirit. I rose slowly, careful not to make any sudden movements that might startle him. "Hey there, boy," I said softly, my voice still a little rough. "Welcome back." Koda's ears twitched at the sound of my voice. He made a low sound in his throat, not a growl, but a soft rumble of acknowledgement. He watched as I added wood to the fire, coaxing the embers back to life until flames licked at the fresh logs. The warmth began to fill the cabin once more. I brought a bowl of fresh water and set it down a few feet from the dog. "Take it easy," I advised. "Just water for now." Koda watched the bowl for a long moment. Then slowly, painfully, he pushed himself up onto his front legs. His back legs trembled with the effort, but he held his position. He stretched his neck forward and began to drink, his lap slow and deliberate. When he was finished, he lay back down, his breathing a little heavier, and fixed his gaze on me again. There was no fear in those eyes, only a profound, weary watchfulness. It was a silent conversation, an acknowledgement of shared vulnerability, and a nascent trust. Later that morning, with the light streaming through the clean-swept window, I knew I had to properly tend to Koda's injuries. The work I had done by firelight had been a desperate patch job. "All right, Koda," I said, approaching slowly with my medical kit. "Let's get a better look at you." I knelt beside the dog, who remained still, his eyes following my every move. He seemed to understand that this human was here to help. I began by gently cleaning the area around the large gash on his flank. As I wiped away the dried blood and applied a fresh layer of antiseptic, I saw it clearly for the first time. The edges of the wound were clean, too clean. There were no ragged tears consistent with an animal's claw or tooth. It looked more like a cut, a deliberate slice made by a sharp object. A cold knot formed in my stomach. This wasn't just an animal attack. This was human malice. My suspicion grew as I examined Koda's other injuries. I found what I had missed in the dark: raw, chafed skin encircling both of his front paws, hidden beneath the thick fur. The marks were unmistakable, the kind left by rope or wire pulled tight, a clear sign of being bound. My hands paused. I had seen marks like these before, on people, in places I tried hard to forget. A surge of old, familiar pain, a deep wounding from my past, resurfaced. This dog had not just been injured, he had been restrained, he had been tortured. A quiet rage, cold and sharp, settled over me. This was not the brutal, honest violence of the wild. This was the calculated cruelty of a human being. I looked at Koda, who met my gaze without flinching, and a wave of profound empathy washed over me. I understood, in a way few could, what it meant to be at the mercy of someone else's malice. I saw not just an animal, but a fellow survivor, another soldier who had seen the worst of the world and somehow made it through. I finished my work in silence, my movements gentle and precise. I restitched the gash with greater care, bandaged the smaller cuts, and applied a soothing salve to the raw skin on his legs. Throughout the entire process, Koda remained perfectly still, enduring the sting of the antiseptic without so much as a whimper. He had placed his complete trust in this stranger, this human who carried his own invisible scars. He was a survivor, and I recognized that in his stillness, in his watchful eyes. His calm acceptance, his unwavering gaze, was a mirror to my own struggle to maintain composure in the face of so much brokenness. This was the first spark of hope I'd felt in years, the quiet dawning of a purpose beyond simply existing. Over the next few days, a quiet routine formed between the two of us. I cared for Koda, feeding him small meals of softened jerky and warm broth, ensuring he always had fresh water and checking his wounds twice a day. Koda, in return, offered his silent companionship. His presence filled the vast, oppressive emptiness of the cabin. I found myself talking to the dog, telling him about the weather, about the book I was reading, about anything at all. The words came easily, a release from the solitary confinement I had imposed upon myself. Koda was a patient listener. He would watch me with that unwavering, intelligent gaze, his head cocked to one side as if he understood every word. His strength returned slowly but surely. By the third day, he could stand on all four legs, and by the fourth, he took his first hesitant steps across the cabin floor, his tail giving a single weak wag. He would follow me from the fireplace to the kitchen, his paws making a soft padding sound on the wooden floorboards, a constant, reassuring presence at my side. One afternoon, as I sat cleaning my rifle, a task I performed out of habit more than necessity, a ritual from my past life, Koda came and rested his great head on my knee. I stopped what I was doing and looked down into those amber eyes. I saw a loyalty there that was absolute, a bond forged in the crucible of a snowstorm and sealed by a shared understanding of pain. I reached down and stroked his thick fur, scratching behind his ears. Koda leaned into the touch, a deep sigh of contentment escaping him. In that moment, the crushing weight of my solitude lifted, replaced by the steady, grounding presence of this resilient creature. We were two broken souls, a man and a dog, who had found each other in the heart of a merciless winter. And in the quiet companionship we offered each other, we had both begun to heal. The nightmares still came, but they were less frequent, their sharp edges blunted by the grounding presence of Koda. I had a purpose beyond my own survival. I had someone to care for, and in turn, I felt cared for. The bond between us had deepened into a silent, profound understanding. We were a pack of two, veterans of different wars, finding solace in our shared solitude, a quiet hope growing in the heart of a cold mountain. A week passed, the rhythm of life in the cabin shifted, finding a new, quieter cadence. The oppressive silence that I had once sought as a shield had been replaced by the soft sounds of companionship. The gentle pad of Koda's paws on the wood floor, his contented sigh as he slept by the fire, the occasional clink of his collar as he shifted. Koda's physical wounds were healing with remarkable speed. The stitches on his flank were clean, and the raw skin on his legs had begun to heal over, covered by the first fuzz of new fur. He was eating well, his strength returning, with each passing day. For the first time in years, a sense of peace settled over me, not the empty peace of solitude, but a richer, more meaningful kind. But as Koda's body healed, something restless began to stir within his spirit. It started suddenly. I would catch the dog standing by the large window that faced the dense northern stretch of the forest, his body rigid, his gaze fixed on a point deep within the trees that I could not see. His ears would be perked forward, every muscle tense, as if listening to a sound only he could hear. Then came the whining. It was not the sound of pain, but a low, mournful, and deeply urgent noise that vibrated with a strange anxiety. "What is it, boy?" I asked the first time it happened, walking over to stand beside him. "See a deer out there?" Koda didn't acknowledge me. His focus was absolute, his entire being directed toward that unseen point in the wilderness. He shifted his weight from one paw to another, his body trembling slightly. I looked out, scanning the endless expanse of snow and pine, but saw nothing but the serene, indifferent beauty of the mountains. At first, I attributed it to the trauma Koda had endured. I had seen men in my unit stare off into the distance, their minds replaying horrors on a loop that no one else could see. I figured the dog was doing the same, his memory haunted by whatever had happened to him in those woods. I would try to distract him, calling his name in a cheerful voice, offering a piece of jerky, or grabbing the leash for a walk. But Koda would ignore it all, his distress growing until I gently led him away from the window. The behavior, however, did not subside. It intensified. Koda began to pace, a restless, agitated circuit from the window to the door and then to me before returning to the window again. The whining became more frequent, more insistent. It was the sound of a creature trying desperately to communicate something it had no words for. He would stop in front of me, look up with those intelligent amber eyes, and let out a soft, pleading whimper before turning his head sharply toward the door. The message was becoming clearer. He needed to go out there. He needed me to follow. "It's just ghosts, Koda," I found myself saying one evening, trying to soothe the agitated animal, and perhaps myself. "They're not real. You're safe here." But as I looked into his eyes, I saw something that wasn't fear. It wasn't the panicked, unfocused look of a tormented memory. It was intelligence. It was purpose. There was a desperate clarity in Koda's gaze, an unwavering conviction that chilled me to the bone. This was not a dog lost in the past. This was a dog with a mission in the present. This wasn't some animal instinct I was observing. This was Koda, the wounded messenger, trying to tell me something vital. He wasn't haunted by his past. He was trying to deliver a message from the present. The turning point came on a cold, clear afternoon. I was sitting at the heavy wooden table, cleaning my hunting knife, a familiar weight in my hand, when Koda approached. The dog didn't whine or pace. Instead, he stood directly in front of me and nudged my hand with his cold, wet nose. A single, deliberate push. I stopped in at what I was doing and looked at him. Koda held my gaze for a long moment, then he turned, walked to the cabin door, and sat, looking back over his shoulder. It was the most direct, unambiguous plea he could have possibly made. In that moment, all of my rationalizations fell away. The training that had been drilled into me in the Marine Corps, the instinct that had kept me alive in the most hostile places on Earth, screamed at me to pay attention. You trust your partner. You listen to the one watching your back. I looked at the proud, resilient animal sitting by the door, and I knew with a certainty that defied all logic that Koda was not haunted. He was calling for help. The sounds he heard were not echoes of the past. They were a cry from the present, a call from someone else who was in trouble, deep in the winter woods. He was trying to tell me something vital. I slowly put down my knife. I stood up and walked to the closet where I kept my gear. Koda watched me, a low whine of anticipation rumbling in his chest. "Okay, boy," I said, my voice quiet but firm. "Okay, you win." I pulled out my heavy-duty winter coat, my pack, and the rifle I kept propped in the corner. I wasn't just going for a walk. I was going on a mission. I did not know what we would find out there, but I knew I could no longer ignore the call. I owed it to the brave animal who had fought his way through a blizzard to find me. I owed it to the silent pact we had made in front of the fire, two survivors recognizing something essential in each other. "Show me," I said, slinging the rifle over my shoulder. "Show me what has you so worried." Koda rose to his feet, his tail giving a single, powerful wag. He stood by the door, his body quivering with a focused, urgent energy, ready to lead the way. This was it. My quiet solitude was over. The moment I opened the cabin door, the sheer scale of the wilderness seemed to press in on us. The cold was a clean, sharp blade against my skin, and the silence was absolute, broken only by the soft crunch of my boots on the fresh powder. The world outside was a vast, unforgiving expanse of white and shadow, the towering pines standing like silent sentinels over a frozen kingdom. For a moment, the rational part of my mind questioned the sanity of this venture, stepping out into the heart of a West Virginia winter on the wordless plea of a dog. But then I looked down. Koda stood beside me, not with the frantic energy of before, but with a calm, focused intensity. His breath plumed in the frigid air, and his amber eyes were fixed on the tree line. There was no doubt in his posture, no hesitation. He was a soldier ready to lead his patrol. I felt my own military instincts take over, pushing aside the last vestiges of uncertainty. I adjusted the weight of the pack on my shoulders, its contents chosen with years of experience: a compact first aid kit, high-energy protein bars, a canteen of water wrapped in wool to keep from freezing, a waterproof container with matches and a fire starter, and a compass. The rifle slung over my shoulder felt familiar and steadying, a tool I hoped I would not need. I patted my hip, ensuring my satellite phone, an avalanche model meant for extreme backcountry, was secure. I had learned never to take chances. Koda gave a soft woof, a quiet command, and then moved. He did not bound into the deep snow, but trotted with a powerful, efficient gait, his strong legs finding purchase where a human would flounder. He was not just running, he was leading. I fell into step behind him, my own long-legged stride eating up the ground. We moved as a unit, a man and a dog, against the immense, indifferent wilderness. The path Koda chose was not a path at all. It was a route born of instinct and memory. He led us through dense stands of pine, their snow-laden branches forming a low, dark canopy over our heads. He navigated around massive fallen logs, their ancient wood covered in a thick blanket of white. He would pause at the edge of frozen streams, his head low as he tested the air before finding a safe place to cross on thick, solid ice. I watched him, impressed by his intelligence and sureness. The dog moved with a knowledge of this forest that seemed innate, as if he were following a map invisible to human eyes. Several times, Koda would stop, his body going completely still. He would lift his nose, tasting the wind, his ears swiveling to catch the faintest sound. I would halt behind him, my own senses on high alert, scanning the trees for any sign of danger. But Koda was not looking for predators. After a moment of concentration, he would turn with renewed certainty and continue on his chosen bearing. He was tracking something, not with scent alone, but with a purpose that burned within him. The deeper we went, the more difficult the terrain became. We ascended steep wooded hillsides, I using the tree trunks to pull myself up through the thigh-deep snow. We descended into shadowed valleys where the cold was even more profound, and the silence felt ancient and heavy. Through it all, Koda never faltered. He would frequently look back, his amber eyes checking on me, waiting for me to catch up, a silent gesture of reassurance and partnership. I would give a small nod, and the dog would press on. The sun climbed higher in the pale blue sky, its light glinting off the endless sea of white, but its warmth barely penetrated the frigid air. We had been walking for hours. My muscles ached with the strain of moving through the heavy snow, but I pushed on, driven by the dog's unwavering resolve. I was no longer just a man seeking solitude. I was a ranger, a former Marine, on a mission again. My focus narrowed to the objective, my trust placed entirely in my point man. Koda was my partner, my scout, and I knew without a doubt that I would follow this dog anywhere. We stopped only once, in a small clearing sheltered from the wind. I took a long drink from my canteen, the water shockingly cold. I broke off a piece of a protein bar and offered it to Koda, who took it gently from my gloved hand. The dog ate quickly, then drank from the fresh snow, his energy seemingly limitless. He did not rest for long. Within minutes, he was on his feet again, looking expectantly at me, his body angled toward the north. The urgency that had started in the cabin was still there, a low, steady flame that the cold could not extinguish. "I'm coming, boy," I said, my voice a low cloud in the air. I shouldered my pack, the weight feeling less burdensome now, and we set off once more. The landscape grew wilder, the signs of human presence, even the distant logging roads I knew were miles behind them, had vanished completely. We were in the true heart of the mountains now, a place of stark, brutal beauty. And still, Koda led on, his gray and white form a moving speck of determination against the vast canvas of the forest. Following the echo of a call that only he could hear, the sun had begun its descent toward the jagged western peaks, painting the endless snowfields in hues of orange and purple. The temperature was dropping rapidly, and the cold, which had been a constant companion, was now starting to bite with real venom. My legs burned with fatigue. Each step through the deep snow was a monumental effort. I had been walking for what felt like an eternity, guided only by the unwavering determination of the dog in front of me. Any lesser animal would have given up hours ago, but Koda pressed on, his purpose a tangible force that pulled me along in his wake. Just as a sliver of doubt began to creep back into my mind, Koda's behavior changed. He stopped abruptly at the crest of a small hill, his body rigid, his head held high. A low growl rumbled deep in his chest, the first aggressive sound I had heard from him. Then he let out a single, sharp bark that cut through the profound silence of the forest. He looked back at me, his eyes blazing with a fierce urgency, before turning his attention forward once more. I moved up beside him, my hand resting on the cold steel of my rifle. I followed the dog's gaze, and that is when I saw it. Barely visible against the darkening sky, a thin, almost imperceptible wisp of gray smoke rising from beyond the next stand of ancient pines. It was a sign of life in a place that felt utterly devoid of it. Koda needed no further encouragement. He plunged down the other side of the hill, his pace quickening. I followed, my exhaustion momentarily forgotten, replaced by a surge of adrenaline. My tactical training took over, and I moved with caution, using the trees for cover as we approached the source of the smoke. The trees thinned, revealing a small, desolate clearing. In its center stood a hunting cabin, a sad, dilapidated structure that seemed to be slowly surrendering to the wilderness. Its log walls were weathered to a pale gray, and one of its windows was boarded over. The roof sagged under the immense weight of accumulated snow, and the entire building listed to one side. If not for that faint curl of smoke rising from its stone chimney, I would have assumed it had been abandoned decades ago. As we drew closer, I noticed the snow around the cabin was an undisturbed blanket of white. There were no tracks leading away from it, meaning no one had left recently, but there was a single narrow path leading to the front door, compressed by use before the last snowfall. Koda's growling grew louder, a continuous menacing rumble. Then I saw what had set the dog on edge, what made my own blood run cold. A heavy rusted chain was wrapped around the door handles, secured by a large, formidable padlock. The smoke meant someone was inside. The lock meant they were a prisoner. "Easy, boy," I whispered, placing a hand on Koda's back, but he could not be calmed. He lunged forward, scratching frantically at the wooden door, his whines now sharp with desperation. I knelt beside the lock. It was old, but it was solid. I scanned the clearing one last time. We were utterly alone. There was no time to hesitate. "Stand back, Koda," I commanded. I gripped my rifle, reversed it, and slammed the heavy stock against the padlock. The sound was a deafening crack in the frozen air. The old metal held. I struck it again, a powerful, focused blow driven by years of training. The shackle groaned. On the third strike, the rusted metal finally gave way with a sharp snap, and the lock fell into the snow. I unwound the heavy chain and let it drop. I took a deep breath, drew the hunting knife from the sheath on my belt, and slowly pushed the door open. It creaked on ancient rusted hinges, revealing an interior shrouded in near darkness. The air that wafted out was stale and frigid, carrying a sickeningly sweet scent of illness and neglect. Koda darted inside without hesitation, his nails clicking on the dusty floorboards. He ran straight through the small main room, toward a partially open door at the back. I followed, my eyes adjusting to the gloom. The cabin was sparsely furnished, a rickety table with a single chair, a few cans of food on a dusty shelf, a worn-out sofa with its springs showing. The only light came from the dying red embers in a small fireplace. My senses on high alert, I followed Koda to the back room, pushing the door open with the toe of my boot. This room was even darker, the only window covered by a tattered, threadbare blanket. But I could make out a shape on a narrow bed, a figure lying motionless under a thin pile of blankets. Koda was at the bedside, whining softly, gently nudging the figure with his nose. I crossed the small room in 2 strides and tore the blanket from the window, allowing the fading twilight to flood the space. And my heart stopped. On the bed lay an elderly woman. Her face was gaunt and pale as bleached bone, her white hair a wild, tangled mess around her head. She was frighteningly thin, her body little more than a skeleton beneath the worn fabric of her clothes. But it was not her emaciated state that caused me to gasp. It was the heavy metal handcuff clamped around her left wrist, its chain bolted directly to the iron bed frame. The skin beneath the cuff was raw and bleeding, a testament to her desperate, futile struggles to break free. I set my rifle against the wall and rushed to her side. "Ma'am, can you hear me?" I reached for her other wrist, my fingers searching for a pulse. It was there, a faint, thready flutter against my fingertips, weak and irregular. Her skin was ice cold. This was Sarah, Koda's owner, and she was dying. I looked from the woman's still face to the dog, who was now licking her hand with a heartbreaking tenderness. All the pieces clicked into place, the cruelty, the desperation, the impossible journey through the snow. Koda had not been running from something. He had been running for someone. Time seemed to warp in the small, frigid room. For a Marine trained to react in seconds, I felt frozen, not by the cold, but by the sheer, calculated cruelty of the scene before me. Sarah's breathing was a shallow whisper, a fragile thread that could snap at any moment. The immediate overriding priority was to free her. I placed my hand gently on her shoulder. "Ma'am, I'm going to get you out of this," I said, my voice low and steady, hoping the sound could penetrate her semi-conscious state. The lock on the handcuff was old and simple, designed more for intimidation than high security. I pulled a multi-tool from a pouch on my belt. With the focused precision of a man defusing a bomb, I worked on the lock's mechanism. Koda watched, his body a tense coil of muscle, a low whine escaping his throat as he nudged Sarah's limp hand. After several tense moments that stretched into an eternity, there was a satisfying click. The cuff sprang open. I carefully chafed her frozen wrist, trying to restore circulation, my touch as gentle as I could manage. I then turned my attention to the immediate threats, hypothermia and dehydration. The embers in the main room's fireplace were a faint, mocking glow. I rushed out, added the last of the dry kindling I could find, and blew on them until a weak flame flickered to life. It was not much, but it was a start. Returning to the back room, I unrolled the Mylar emergency blanket from my pack. The crinkle of the foil sounded deafeningly loud in the silence. I wrapped it around Sarah's frail body, creating a cocoon to reflect what little body heat she had left. Next came the water. I knew I could not give her much at once. I uncapped my canteen, poured a small amount into the lid, and gently cradled her head. "Just a little, ma'am, just a sip," I urged. I touched the cold metal to her cracked lips, and instinctively she drank, a faint, raspy sound in her throat. I gave her another sip and then another before pulling away. It was enough for now. With the immediate crisis managed, I needed to understand what had happened here. I needed a name. I needed to know the full story. I scanned the squalid main room, my eyes searching for anything that could offer a clue, and then I saw it. On the rickety table, half hidden beneath a dirty rag, was a small leather-bound book. It was a diary, its cover warped by damp and its pages swollen. I picked it up with a sense of reverence and dread. I sat in the single wobbly chair by the newly rekindled fire, with Koda resting his head on my boot, and opened it. The handwriting inside was elegant at first, but grew shaky and desperate as the pages turned. The first entry was dated 3 months ago. "My nephew Dylan brought me up to the old hunting cabin today. He said it was for a weekend retreat, a chance to get away from the city. He has been so attentive lately, ever since he fell into those financial troubles." My jaw tightened. I flipped forward a few pages. "He's not letting me leave. He told me this morning he said he knows about the land, about the mining survey from last year. He knows the original deed is all that matters since the county records office burned down in 1998. He wants the papers. He says I owe him that. Our family's legacy belongs to him. I told him he would get nothing. He just smiled and locked the door." The cold fury in my gut intensified. I read on, the entries becoming a heartbreaking chronicle of despair. Sarah wrote about the cold, the hunger, the gnawing loneliness. She described Dylan's visits, how he would bring just enough food and water to keep her alive. He was not just imprisoning her, He was methodically breaking her will. "He enjoys this," one entry read, the words barely legible. "He sits in this very chair and eats a hot meal in front of me while I shiver. He tells me all he needs is my signature or for me to tell him where I've hidden the deed. He says he can wait. The cruelty is the point. It is not just about the money anymore. It is about power." I felt a surge of sickness. I knew that kind of evil. I had seen it in the eyes of men in faraway lands. I turned the page, and my breath caught in my throat. Dylan came today in a rage. He had been drinking. Koda tried to protect me. My brave, beautiful boy stood between us and would not back down. Dylan kicked him, and then he took a piece of rope. I cannot write what he did. I heard Koda's cries, and then there was silence. Dylan came back in, his hands bloody, and said the mutt wouldn't be a problem anymore. He dragged Koda outside and left him in the snow. I pray he was wrong. I pray my boy managed to run, to find someone, anyone. He is my only hope. Left. I closed my eyes. The image of Koda collapsed on my doorstep, searing itself into my mind. He was not just a stray caught in a storm. He was a messenger, a hero who had survived the unthinkable to complete his final mission. I gently closed the diary. The entire ugly story was laid bare. A desperate man named Dylan, driven by greed and debt, torturing his own flesh and blood for a piece of paper. I looked from the diary to the still form on the bed, and then to the loyal dog who had not left her side. My own quest for solitude felt like a selfish indulgence in comparison. My war had ended, but theirs was still being fought, and now I was a part of it. My mission was no longer about escape. It was about protection. I would be the wall that stood between them and the monster in the woods. I settled into the chair for a long watch, the fire casting flickering shadows on the walls, with Koda's steady breathing a comforting rhythm in the dark. The night was far from over. The hours bled into one another, marked only by the slow consumption of the logs in the fireplace. I remained vigilant, a sentinel in the oppressive silence of the cabin. I had moved Sarah, still wrapped in the mylar blanket, onto the lumpy sofa in the main room, closer to the life-giving warmth of the fire. She had not stirred, her existence a fragile flicker in the vast, cold darkness. Koda lay on the floor at her feet, a living, breathing guardian, his head on his paws, but his ears alert to every creak and groan of the old cabin. The night was at its deepest and darkest when Koda's head shot up. A low, guttural growl vibrated in his chest, a sound of pure menace that was entirely different from his earlier whines of concern. He rose to his feet in a single fluid motion, the fur along his spine bristling. He positioned himself squarely in front of the sofa, his body a solid wall between Sarah and the door. I was instantly on my feet, the rifle in my hands. I moved silently to the side of the single front window, peering through a crack in the wood. At first, I saw nothing but the ghostly, moonlit expanse of snow. Then a figure emerged from the tree line, a dark silhouette moving with purpose toward the cabin. The man was carrying a duffel bag. Dylan. My heart hammered against my ribs, not with fear, but with a cold, focused rage. I checked the chamber of my rifle. I was ready. The footsteps crunched in the snow, stopping just outside the door. There was the sound of a key scraping in the lock. I tensed. The door swung open, letting in a blast of frigid air that made the fire dance wildly. Dylan stepped inside, stamping the snow from his boots. He was a man in his late 20s, with a weak chin and restless, shifty eyes that darted around the room. He wore an expensive winter jacket that looked out of place with his frayed jeans and worn-out boots. His face was a mask of irritation and impatience. He hadn't noticed us yet. "Rise and shine, Auntie," he called out, mockingly, dropping the duffel bag on the floor. "Brought you some more five-star cuisine." He turned toward the back room, and then he froze. His eyes landed on the empty bed, then snapped back to the main room, widening in confusion and then alarm as he saw me standing in the shadows. "Who the hell are you?" Dylan demanded, his hand instinctively going to his belt. But before I could answer, Dylan's gaze dropped to the floor. He saw the magnificent gray and white German shepherd standing guard, teeth bared in a silent snarl. Recognition, followed by sheer, unadulterated disbelief, washed over his face. "No way," he whispered, taking an involuntary step back. "I killed you." That was all the confession I needed. In that moment, Koda lunged. He moved not like a dog, but like a furry missile, a blur of righteous fury aimed directly at the man who had tortured him and his mistress. Dylan cried out in terror, stumbling backward, barely managing to get his arm up in a pathetic attempt to fend off the attack. I moved at the same time, my goal not to kill, but to neutralize. I charged forward, using my larger frame to slam Dylan against the rough log wall. The man's head connected with the wood with a dull thud. Koda, seeing his new master in control, ceased his attack but remained close, his growling a constant, terrifying promise of violence. "It's over," I said, my voice a low, dangerous growl of its own. I pressed the barrel of the rifle into Dylan's chest, pinning him to the wall. Desperation gave Dylan a surge of strength. With a wild cry, he twisted, shoving me off balance. He wasn't a trained fighter, but he was a cornered animal. He swung a clumsy fist that I easily deflected, but in the chaotic scuffle, Dylan's flailing arm connected with the rickety table. The old kerosene lantern that sat on its edge teetered for a moment, and then crashed to the floor. The glass shattered, and the world erupted in flame. The spilled kerosene ignited instantly, a whoosh of orange flame that greedily consumed the dry, dusty floorboards. The fire spread with terrifying speed, licking up the log walls, feeding on decades of dry timber. The small cabin, which had been a prison of cold, was suddenly transformed into an inferno. The heat was intense, the smoke thick and acrid. The fight was forgotten, replaced by the primal, immediate need for survival. Dylan scrambled away from the flames, his eyes wide with panic, coughing and sputtering. I had a split second to make a decision. Dylan was a threat, but the fire was the immediate enemy. My gaze snapped to Sarah, still motionless on the sofa as the flames crept closer. There was no choice to be made. I turned my back on Dylan and rushed to her side. "Koda, with me!" I yelled over the roar of the fire. I scooped the frail woman into my arms. She was terrifyingly light. The mylar blanket crackled as I lifted her. The smoke was already a thick, choking cloud, burning my lungs with every breath. I could barely see the door through the haze. Koda was at my heels, barking frantically, guiding me through the blinding smoke. The cabin was groaning around us, the sound of a dying beast. We had seconds, not minutes, before the whole structure came down. I burst through the doorway into the blessed, biting cold of the winter night, my lungs screaming for air. Behind me, the cabin roared, a monstrous living thing of fire and fury, greedily devouring itself. A shower of sparks rained down around us as I staggered away from the inferno, Sarah's frail body held tight against my chest. Koda was a loyal shadow at my side, barking a frantic rhythm that was half warning, half triumph. I didn't stop until we were at the edge of the clearing, a safe distance from the collapsing structure. I gently laid Sarah down in the snow, first placing my own heavy coat beneath her to shield her from the freezing ground. The fire cast a hellish, dancing orange light across the landscape, illuminating the scene in stark relief. Through the haze, I saw Dylan stumble out of the doorway, his clothes smoldering, before collapsing to his knees in the snow, beating at the embers on his jacket. He was alive, but my focus was solely on the woman I had just saved. Sarah was coughing weakly, her body trembling uncontrollably. The smoke and the sudden shock had pulled her from the depths of unconsciousness into a state of feverish delirium. Her eyes, wide and unfocused, stared past me and into the flames. "No," she whispered, her voice a dry, rattling rasp. "Everything. It's all in there." "It's all right, Sarah," I said gently, trying to soothe her. "We're out. We're safe." But she didn't seem to hear me. Her mind was trapped in the past, panicked by a different kind of loss. A surprising strength flowed into her frail limbs, and she gripped my arm, her fingers like talons. "The coat!" she gasped, her eyes locking onto mine with a desperate clarity. "My old winter coat. It was by the woodpile. The papers. David needs them. Ah, the name. It struck me with a strange resonance, David, my grandfather's name, but I dismissed it as the rambling of a traumatized mind. Sarah, there's nothing left. It's all gone." "No," she insisted, shaking her head on the snowy ground. "Inside the lining, I sewed them in. Please, it's all I have left of him. It's for David." The urgency in her voice, the repetition of that name, was impossible to ignore. His grandfather's name. It had to be a coincidence. Yet, I found myself scanning the edge of the clearing. My eyes settled on a small, rickety woodpile, a few yards from the cabin, miraculously just beyond the fire's immediate reach. Draped over it was the dark shape of a long, old-fashioned wool coat, singed at the edges but largely intact. I gave Sarah's shoulder a reassuring squeeze. "I'll be right back." I moved quickly, my boots sinking into the deep snow. I grabbed the coat. It was heavy and smelled of cedar and mothballs. Returning to Sarah's side, I knelt once more in the snow under the flickering firelight. "This one?" I asked softly. She nodded weakly, her eyes already beginning to close again. My fingers, numb with cold, searched the thick inner lining of the coat near the bottom hem. I felt it, a thick, stiff packet of papers sewn skillfully between the layers of wool and silk. I pulled the hunting knife from my belt and with the utmost care sliced the stitches of the seam. I reached inside and pulled out a bundle wrapped in oilskin, still dry and perfectly preserved. Koda, sensing a shift in my demeanor, crept closer, resting his head on my thigh as if to offer support. I carefully unwrapped it. Inside were several pages of yellowed, official-looking documents, folded neatly. I unfolded the top page. It was a land deed, the type formal and archaic, dated 1972. My eyes scanned the intricate legal text until they found what I was looking for, the names of the proprietors. The first name was typed in clear, bold letters, Sarah Elizabeth Ashford. I took a steadying breath and read the second name. The world tilted on its axis. The roar of the fire faded to a distant hum. The freezing air no longer seemed to touch my skin. For a moment, I thought I had misread it, that the smoke and the flickering light were playing tricks on my eyes. But there was no mistake. The name was printed with absolute, undeniable clarity. David Michael Vance, my grandfather, my own namesake. It was impossible. It made no sense. And yet, it explained everything. The puzzle pieces of my grandfather's life, pieces I never even knew were missing, slammed into place with the force of a physical blow. The quiet, unshakable sadness that had always lived behind the old man's eyes. The reason he had never remarried, never even spoken of another woman after Grandma passed. The half-forgotten story my own father had once told me about a girl his grandfather was supposed to marry before he went to war. A girl who had simply disappeared from his life. I looked from the name on the paper to the frail, unconscious woman lying in the snow. This was not just a stranger Koda had led me to. This was Sarah, my grandfather's Sarah, the fiancée he had lost, the ghost who had haunted my family's history without them even knowing it. Koda had not just led me on a rescue mission. He had led me to a living, breathing piece of my own past. I sank to my knees in the snow, the papers trembling in my hand, the burning cabin a mere backdrop to the inferno of revelation that had just consumed my world. This was liberation, a shattering of old narratives, and the start of a deep, profound healing. The universe had collapsed into 3 points of reality: the roaring inferno of the cabin, the impossible truth of the papers in my hand, and the fragile woman shivering at my feet. I knelt in the snow, momentarily paralyzed by the revelation. David and Sarah, my grandfather and this woman, a lifetime of unspoken sorrow and lost love, was laid bare in the flickering, hellish light of the fire. Koda nudged my hand, a wet nose against my frozen fingers, pulling me back from the precipice of shock. The dog's whine was low and urgent. He was right. This was not the time for reflection. This was a time for survival. Sarah's breathing was growing more shallow, her skin an unnerving, waxy pale. The cold was a relentless enemy, and the fire, while providing a distant warmth, was no match for the deep chill that had settled into her bones. I had to get her help. My own cabin was hours away, an impossible journey carrying an unconscious woman through the treacherous, snow-covered terrain. My mind, honed by years of battlefield assessments, raced through the options. There were none. We were trapped. And then I saw it. Far across the valley, on the opposing ridge, were faint bobbing lights, 2 of them. It had to be a forest ranger patrol on snowmobiles, drawn by the massive column of smoke and flame now billowing into the night sky. The fire was a beacon, but it was an ambiguous one. It could mean a tragedy that was already over. I needed to signal that there were survivors, that we needed help now. I carefully placed the precious documents inside my jacket, zipping it up to my chin. I stood, my rifle feeling solid and reassuring in my grip. "Stay with her, Koda," I commanded. The dog didn't need to be told. He was already a steadfast guardian. I moved to the center of the clearing, a clear line of sight to the distant ridge. I aimed the rifle toward the dark, star-filled sky, away from the lights. I took a deep, steadying breath, the frigid air burning my lungs. Then I fired. The crack of the shot was explosive, a violent rip in the fabric of the mountain silence. It echoed off the surrounding peaks, a desperate call for help. I waited a few seconds, then fired again, and a third time. 3 shots, the universal signal of distress. I watched the lights on the ridge for a moment. They stopped. Then they began to move again, faster this time, heading down into the valley directly toward us. Relief, potent and overwhelming, washed over me. Help was coming. It felt like an eternity, but it was likely less than 30 minutes before the sound of engines grew louder, cutting through the crackle of the fire. 2 snowmobiles crested a nearby hill, their headlights slicing through the darkness. They slowed as they entered the clearing, the 2 riders dismounting cautiously, their hands near their sidearms. One was a younger deputy, the other an older man whose calm, authoritative presence was immediately apparent. He wore a heavy winter coat with a sheriff's star pinned to the chest. This was Sheriff Brody, a man in his late 50s, with a face weathered by decades of West Virginia winters and a gaze that missed nothing. He took in the scene with a practiced eye, the inferno of the cabin, the defeated figure of Dylan still huddled in the snow, and me standing guard over Sarah on the ground, a rifle held loosely at my side. "Sheriff Brody, Gallatin County," the older man announced, his voice a calm baritone. "What's the situation here?" I lowered my rifle, keeping my hands visible. "Thank God you're here, Sheriff. My name is Alex. This woman needs immediate medical attention, hypothermia, malnutrition, smoke inhalation." Sheriff Brody's eyes moved from Sarah's still form to me. "And him?" he asked, nodding toward Dylan. "That's Dylan. He was holding her prisoner in that cabin. I found them a few hours ago. He's the reason for all this," I said, my voice flat and devoid of the rage simmering beneath the surface. The sheriff gave a curt nod to his deputy, a young man I recognized as Deputy Miller. "Cuff him." The younger deputy moved swiftly, pulling a dazed and compliant Dylan to his feet and securing his hands behind his back. Sheriff Brody knelt beside Sarah, his gloved hand checking for a pulse at her neck. "It's thready," he said, his expression grim. He looked up at me. "What's your connection to this?" "It's complicated," I replied, "but she's the reason I'm here." I pointed to Koda, who had not moved from Sarah's side. "Her dog found me." The sheriff's radio crackled to life. He was already calling for a medevac helicopter, his report concise and professional. The nearest hospital was over an hour away by road, a journey Sarah might not survive. A flight was her only chance. Within minutes, the clearing was filled with more people. A ground rescue team had arrived, and 2 paramedics immediately took over Sarah's care. They worked with quiet, efficient urgency, wrapping her in specialized thermal blankets, starting an IV, and monitoring her vital signs. As they worked, the distant but unmistakable sound of rotors began to echo through the valley. It grew steadily louder until a powerful searchlight cut through the darkness from above, sweeping across the snow and the burning remnants of the cabin. The helicopter descended, the downdraft from its blades creating a miniature blizzard, whipping snow and ash into a frenzy. It landed in the widest part of the clearing. 2 flight medics jumped out, their movements practiced and sure, and rushed to the stretcher where Sarah was now secured. "We're taking her to Charleston Medical Center," one of the medics yelled over the deafening noise. "She's critical!" It was now or never. As they prepared to lift her, Koda let out a heart-wrenching bark and tried to follow, his loyalty overriding all else. I quickly knelt and grabbed his collar. "Easy, boy." "They're helping her. She's going to be okay." I held the dog close, murmuring reassurances as I watched the medics carry Sarah toward the waiting helicopter. Sheriff Brody placed a hand on my shoulder. "We'll need a full statement from you, son, and we'll need whatever evidence you have." I reached into my jacket and pulled out the oilskin packet. I handed the papers to the sheriff. "This is why he did it." "This is everything." The sheriff took the packet without looking at it, tucking it safely inside his own coat. The medics had loaded Sarah into the helicopter. One of them looked back at me. "We have room for one more if you're family." I looked at Koda, then back at the helicopter. "No!" I shouted over the rotors. "I need to stay with the dog." The medic gave a thumbs up. The helicopter door slid shut, the roar of the engines intensified, and the massive machine lifted off the ground, ascending into the dark sky. Koda and I stood side by side, watching as the lights of the helicopter grew smaller and smaller, a single point of hope disappearing into the vast, unforgiving night. The fire was dying now, and a profound silence began to settle over the clearing once more. The weeks that followed were a blur of sterile white hospital walls, the soft beeping of machines, and long, quiet drives on snow-cleared roads. After giving a detailed statement to Sheriff Brody that night, I had guided the authorities back to my own cabin. The journey felt surreal, the familiar path now laden with the weight of all that had happened. The solitude I had once craved now felt like a hollow, aching void. I drove to the hospital in Charleston every other day. Koda, a silent and stoic companion, would sit in the passenger seat of the old pickup truck, his amber eyes fixed on the road ahead. He seemed to understand where we were going, who we were going to see. At first, Sarah was too weak to speak much. I would simply sit by her bedside, a quiet presence in the room, while Koda lay on the floor, his head resting near the bed, a furry, reassuring anchor to the world. Slowly, she began to heal. The color returned to her cheeks, and the light of awareness returned to her eyes. She would watch me, a question lingering in her gaze. One afternoon, when she was stronger, I finally told her everything. I told her my name was Alex, and that the cabin she had described, the safe haven in Koda's memory, belonged to my grandfather. I told her my grandfather's name was David Vance. Tears streamed down Sarah's weathered cheeks, not tears of sorrow, but of a profound, bittersweet wonder. She told me of their engagement, of the war that had stolen him away, and of the mistaken report that had shattered her world and sent her running from a past too painful to bear. In that small, quiet hospital room, the broken threads of a story 50 years old were finally woven back together. I was not just her rescuer. I was the grandson of the man she had never stopped loving. And she was not just a victim. She was the missing piece of my own family's history. The day Sarah was discharged from the hospital, the late winter sun was bright, casting long shadows across the melting snow. She had nowhere to go. The cabin that had been her prison was a charred ruin, and Dylan was in custody, facing a litany of serious charges. She had no other family. "You can stay with me," I said, the words feeling more natural than I ever would have imagined. "At David's cabin. It's your home too, in a way." And so she did. The three of them, a man who had sought isolation, a woman who had been forcibly isolated, and the dog who had bridged the chasm between them, drove back into the mountains. As Sarah stepped across the threshold of the cabin, for the first time, she paused, her hand resting on the rough-hewn doorframe. A soft smile touched her lips. "It still feels like him," she whispered. They became a family, an unconventional unit bound by tragedy and a shared history. The quiet routine of my life was replaced by a gentle, comforting rhythm. We would share meals at the old wooden table. Sarah would tell stories of a young, vibrant David, filling in the gaps of a man I had only known in his quiet later years. I, in turn, found myself speaking of my own service, sharing the burdens I had carried alone for so long with someone who understood loss in its deepest sense. Koda was their constant shadow, dividing his loyalty equally, a living testament to their incredible journey. One evening, as we sat by the fire, the authenticated land deeds resting on the table between us, we spoke of the future. The mineral rights were indeed valuable, a fact confirmed by the county appraiser. "I don't want it," Sarah said quietly, her eyes on the flames. "Money is what drove Dylan to madness. I just want peace," I nodded in agreement. The land, the potential wealth, it all felt secondary. "It was meant to be for your future together," I said, "yours and David's." An idea began to form, a purpose that rose from the ashes of the past. We would not sell. We would not exploit the land for personal gain. Instead, we would honor the legacy that had been so violently interrupted. We established a trust, a foundation named the David and Sarah Vance Fund. With the help of a lawyer from town and even a quiet assist from Sheriff Brody, we arranged to lease the mineral rights to an ethical mining company with strict environmental protections in place. The profits, far more than either of us would ever need, would be dedicated to two causes close to our hearts: supporting veterans struggling with the invisible wounds of war and funding under-resourced animal rescue shelters, places that gave second chances to creatures like Koda. Later, I had the pleasure of meeting a dedicated K9 trainer named Peterson at one of the shelters we helped fund, a man who understood the profound bond between humans and dogs. Spring arrived in the West Virginia mountains, a slow, beautiful thaw that turned the world green again. Sarah and I worked together, not just on the foundation, but on the cabin itself. It was no longer just a shelter, it was a home. I built a ramp for the front porch, and she planted wildflowers in the soil, their colors a vibrant rebellion against the memory of the long, hard winter. One warm evening, we sat on the porch swing, a gentle breeze rustling the new leaves on the pines. Koda lay at our feet, his head resting on my boot, his body relaxed in the easy contentment of a dog who knows he is home. The mountains that had once been a symbol of isolation now felt like a protective embrace. "He would have loved this," Sarah said, her voice soft with memory. "He would have loved you." I looked out at the vast, peaceful wilderness. The ghosts that had followed me here had grown quiet, their voices replaced by the gentle murmur of a life rebuilt. I had come to this mountain, seeking an end to my story, a quiet place to fade away. Instead, I had found a new beginning. I reached down and stroked Koda's head, my heart filled with a gratitude so profound it was almost painful. We had found our purpose in the echoes of the past, two old souls from different wars, brought together by one extraordinary dog. Here, at the very place where the tragedy had begun, we had found our peace. If this journey of finding hope and family in the unexpected resonated with you, consider giving this video a like and sharing it with someone who might need a reminder that even in the darkest storms, light can break through. And if you want to be part of our storytelling family, make sure to subscribe so you don't miss our next adventure.